Welcome back to the Preacher's Podcast. We are at the first Sunday in Lent for YrC. Our series theme for this season is Crushed, where we're looking at things that can crush us under, like a load of guilt or regret, and we see how Jesus crushes all those things. The theme of our specific day is that our temptation is crushed by Christ's obedience. Our participants today are Pastor Jonathan Bauer of Good News Lutheran in Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, Pastor Joel Rousseau of Faith Lutheran in Tallahassee, and Professor Brad Wardell from Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. I'm John Hine, coordinator of Wells Congregational Services. Joel, I'm going to ask you to set the stage for us. When people leave church from this first Sunday in Lent, what are you hoping is the main point of the service that they take home with them?
So someone said one time, it was another preacher, and this stuck with me, that the first Sunday in Lent could be called Active Obedience Sunday, because you see Christ stand and fight the battle against the tempter and temptation. And of course, he does so in our place. And so I think the big takeaway I want people to know is, first of all, that he won the victory for us, but that he also equips us for all the battles we have. So there'll be a big focus, I think, for me in active temptation as I preach this, although when we get into the text itself, you do see the passive obedience of Christ as well.
Yeah, you're right. The text is a great juxtaposition of those 2 points. That maybe brings me to you, John. So the first reading, a familiar story of David and Goliath. The gospel gives us kind of a similar type of story, another battle of champions where you have Satan, the prince of demons, going against mankind's champion, Jesus Christ, in the Luke 4 account of Jesus' temptation. But the sermon text that Joel just mentioned is Hebrews4. How do you see that text doing the job of driving home our theme for the day?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, in both of those other 2 readings, the first reading from the Old Testament and the Gospel, you've got this one-on-one battle going on. And, as obvious as it sounds to anyone who understands the message of the Bible, if we didn't know any better, we might think, well, okay, here's 2 champions going one-on-one, good for them. What does this have to do with me? And it's really that second reading from Hebrews that lets us know what's going on, that really, even going back farther than Samuel or the lesson from Samuel with David and Goliath, God had been teaching his people that the way you are going to be saved is by one person representing all the people, one person representing the entire nation before God. And that really was embodied in the role of the high priest. And so as the writer of Hebrews talks about that role in these verses, that's really what brings it all together, that Jesus is serving in this role in his battle against Satan. He's not just doing this to prove, his might or his worth. He's doing this as the representative for all of us.
That's great. Brad, let me go to you. Guys have done their text study by now. So do you have any initial thoughts, either about something in the text itself, or if you want to go more broad about the main message of the text, that's fine too.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd start out, first of all, by just talking about the letter to the Hebrews itself. The whole letter really is a unique letter in the New Testament, with its many, many quotes of the Old Testament. I think 35 quotes, 34 allusions to the Old Testament. The author obviously knew the Old Testament very, very well, and may have been Apollos, as Luther thought, or may have been somebody like Apollos. But he's, as important as the author is for this letter, I think for our discussion today, even more important are the recipients of this letter. As both Joel and John mentioned, we're in a battle. We are in a battle. And we need a champion to fight for us, someone to help us, because we're going to lose if we're fighting on our own. But if we have someone fighting for us, someone who can overcome even the devil himself, then we have hope. and we have confidence as we live our life in this sinful world. So I think the letter to the Hebrews is very helpful to us because the age in which we live, we're getting to be more and more like the original recipients of this letter. I think the original recipients were living in the 60s in Rome. They had come to know the Bible. They maybe were Jews who came to know that Jesus is the Messiah, and they're being persecuted. Under Claudius, they're having their property taken away. They're being driven out of Rome. Perhaps many of the believers are drifting away and turning away from their faith. And the believers who are there, they very much need encouragement. They need strengthening. They need warnings. And so the is just an amazing mix of Bible doctrine and encouragement, Bible doctrine and encouragement, alternating one between and so we start out with Christology, and then encouragement and Christology and encouragement. And I think that's what we need to preach on this Sunday, is the glory of Christ, and then encouragement not to drift away.
Can I jump in there real quick with a thought that I had that's very much connected to what Professor Wardell is saying? So what's interesting to me about these verses, and as Professor mentioned, there's this back and forth throughout the letter of here's some instruction and then here's some encouragement. But if you look at the text itself, even though there certainly are elements of instruction that are in here, the thing as a whole is an encouragement. He says, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. And that's interesting because this is the very start of the whole big section of the book that relates to Jesus as our high priest. The writer had just been talking about Moses, and there's almost this very sudden and unexpected jump to where he's now not talking about Moses and the prophetic office anymore, but now he's going to be talking about high priest. And so I think what's helpful for a preacher is to actually look at the verses that are immediately following these verses at the end of chapter 4. You almost would think they should be in the opposite order, because in chapter 5, 1 through 5, the writer kind of lays some of the groundwork for what the role and the qualifications were for a high priest that help kind of lay the groundwork for the writer in the previous verses saying this is the role that Jesus played. So it's just kind of it's very striking that he kind of jumps in head first with this encouragement about Jesus being our high priest. But I think those verses at the beginning of chapter 5 are really helpful for the preacher to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, let me go back to you. So guys are probably getting itchy to start writing the sermon. So you have any initial thoughts on how you might handle this text?
Yeah, I think there are a number of approaches you could take. Something that struck me a little bit, and maybe the guys can comment on this as well, is you have this idea of battling, and so you get into our temptations a little bit, but you don't have any specific temptations mentioned. So if you look at the gospel for the Sunday, here's how Satan tempted Jesus, and yet we don't have any specific ones mentioned for us. And so it had me thinking a little bit more broadly. And maybe this is a bad picture, but I started to think about how almost like a boot camp or a basic training type thing. We are going to be tempted. We are going to face battles and struggles with the flesh, with the world, with Satan. So what are some truths that would encourage us and equip us for the battle? And that was a kind of a mindset that I took with it, is that, you just kind of walk through, and it's striking, though, if you're thinking of the battle mentality, that it doesn't mention that we have a great general. It mentions that we have a great high priest. And so that right there is a great, I think you have a lot of preaching to do there to get people up to speed on this. I think a malady kind of tying into that a little bit is that the devil loves to misrepresent our representative, or to have a substitute for our substitute. And what I mean by that is we have a high priest. We have someone who can sympathize with us and our weaknesses, and yet he wants to misrepresent that. So it's like, yeah, You know, you can't rely on the Lord. He doesn't know how to relate to you, or yeah, there's no hope for you, or whatever it might be. I think just the language itself is so striking, that it's not our day-to-day language. That if you're talking to the average person in church and saying, "Hey, we've got a great high priest," their first reaction might be, "So, what does that mean for me today? I don't get it." That again, the devil would love to have us have this disconnect of who our representative is and why this is such a powerful picture. Um, those are a few thoughts stored in my mind of just a kind of a 30,000-foot view of the text itself, of that this is equipping us for battle by pointing us to the champion. And how does he help us then? And John had mentioned earlier of the encouragement of let's go to him, and the encouragement to keep fighting.
I was thinking some similar thoughts along those same lines, Joel, and I really like how you articulated that. There's kind of a double possible misunderstanding. So on the one hand, I think it's really easy for us to think, boy, the things that I go through as a weak, frail human being, like Jesus doesn't know what that's like. And then at the same time, we look at the very few specific temptations that the Bible does tell us about for Jesus, namely in today's gospel. And we're tempted to think those aren't anything like the temptations I go through. I've never been tempted to use my almighty power to turn stones into bread, you know. But this text, especially verse 15, brings both of those together, right? So, you know, if you were preaching on the gospel, and I've done this in the past, it's really a golden opportunity to illustrate how the temptations that Satan brought to Jesus are in fact emblematic of how he works in general, including in our lives. So that's that side of it. But then in preaching on this text, to more stress what you mentioned, that the temptations that we go through, that we feel, Jesus was not in any way like immune to those or distant from those. And I think where I've really found value in this verse specifically, maybe not so much in preaching, but especially in teaching, and specifically teaching confirmation class to 7th and 8th graders, is that as we go through the 10 commandments and we talk about sins against those commandments, we of course want to also use that as an opportunity to talk about how Jesus kept those commandments perfectly in our place. And in lots of cases, there's examples from Jesus' life where we can point to that, but not with every commandment. And specifically, the one that sticks out to me is the 6th commandment. We don't really have a lot of evidence from Jesus' life of him keeping the 6th commandment. But even in our catechism, when it gets to that part of the 6th commandment, this is the passage that they reference, to just say, hey, lest you think that Jesus didn't face the temptation of lust, look at Hebrews 4, verse 15. He has faced every temptation that we have faced.
You know, what's interesting, John, is so I sometimes as a reference point when I'm preaching is I'll, you know, consult the confessions or look at the references at the back of the catechism. And it is interesting that it mentions this verse with the 6th commandment. And then I'll have to go back and look again. I think it was the 9th and 10th commandments. So it skipped the other ones. I've certainly actively obeyed all those too, but it is interesting. Those ones mentioned specifically, and certainly those are struggles for us, and yet he walked through perfectly.
One thing I appreciate about the text, even though it's a short text, is that it emphasizes the qualities of our perfect substitute, our perfect champion. It has everything in it to tell us why he is absolutely perfect for us. He's God himself. He is the Son of God. He's also a human being. He's like us in every single way, except that he was without sin. And he is the great high priest, the one who is the between God and us. And he is so great. He's even greater than the priestly line of Aaron. He's in the order of Melchizedek. He is an eternal priest who has ascended into the heavens and brings the blood that has purchased our forgiveness right into the presence of God. He's a perfect champion for us.
I think that a benefit of this text, when you compared to the first text and the last text, where you kind of just get that battle of the champions, and just, what a champion was. It's been a while since I studied this, but I know that like in history, it was pretty rare where they would do a battle of the champions and that would actually settle it. It was kind of like a pep rally that, okay, our guy just beat you, so now we're going to go to war and we're inspired. And if that's what the gospel lesson is an inspiration for me now to go and do what Jesus did. And he didn't use his divine power. He just used the word to stand up against all the temptations. That text has the potential to eviscerate someone for how poorly so just to say, okay, yes, he's our champion, but also in the sense of that he's our high priest, that he's made the sacrifice for the times that I haven't used the word to stand up against Satan's temptation is probably, I know I probably preached that way badly in the past, where I point to like John said, the various types of temptation. So a temptation of the flesh, a temptation of the easy road, a temptation to twist the word of God to make it say what I would like it to say. And said, well, you can overcome those with God's word. Here, Jesus is the example when that's really not the point of the gospel lesson at all.
I was thinking about that, in terms of how we might help people sort of grasp in a more tangible way the role that the high priest played in the lives of God's people in the Old Testament. We obviously, we don't think in those terms, at least specifically with that office, but we certainly have other areas of our life where someone has the role of representing us. So things that I think people are fairly familiar with, if you've ever had to deal with an insurance agent, if you get in a car accident or something like that it's their job to go to bat for you. Real estate agent would be another example. And, I think the one that maybe not as many people have a firsthand experience with, but we're certainly familiar with from just our general knowledge of life is the idea of a defense attorney. And I heard someone say, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I heard someone say the first rule of lawyering is to get your client to shut up, to make sure that you can do all of the talking. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind with a text like this. As the client who's being represented by the high priest, we want to jump in right away, and we want to either make excuses for our sin or, following Jesus' example, say, okay, now I know I can do this. I can follow his example, but this is a Sunday to kind of shut up and let him do the talking as the one who represents us and did it perfectly for us.
Maybe to that a little bit, I made the comment before, I think one area that you could possibly preach some malady is misrepresenting our representative. And I think you hit on one, John Hine, with Jesus becomes only example then. You read this and go, okay, Jesus fought the devil. I'm going to fight the devil too. I'm going to use the word of God. Well, no, he's called the high priest here. And we have a throne of grace to go to. There's a different focus there than just saying, hey, learn from Jesus in this. Well, yeah, you learn from Jesus in this, but rely on Jesus in this. That's where we find our grace, and that's where we find our comfort in time of need.
I think that's a picture, the way it's a throne almost made out of grace, a throne from which grace is flowing. And that's completely right. We didn't contribute anything to the battle. We didn't fight in any way to somehow accomplish our forgiveness or our salvation. Jesus did this single-handedly for us, and we simply go in his name to the throne of our Father in heaven, and he graciously forgives us.
Yeah, great thoughts. We've touched on a malady. I mean, and maybe we've already touched when we talk about specific gospel. Maybe we've already touched on it and just saying. I think Joel, when you said active obedience Sunday, you guys have any thoughts on that? The unique way to preach, and maybe John, you got it. And you talked about expanding on the role of the high priest, what that is. But any thoughts about the comfort you're going to try and deliver?
I mean, I think we've stressed one side of it, which of course is Jesus' ability to do this perfectly, which is what makes him so different from us. And if we think in terms of that picture of a champion or someone who's going to battle for us on behalf of the rest of us, that idea of, well, he's so much superior to me, he's so much better than me, is really a facet of that picture, which is, again, is an important one. I think the other side of the beauty found in the picture of a high priest is the one that the writer does a phenomenal job of stressing, that because, yes, he's different from us in that he's without sin, but he's like us in every other way. In these verses, that comes out in the fact that he can have sympathy. He can have empathy with us. He's not someone who is, how come I can do this so perfectly and easily and you guys are so terrible at it? He's someone that can empathize with us. And then it's really striking in the verses that follow, verse 2 of chapter 5, where it says he's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray. So just this incredible combination of someone who is so different from us in his holiness, but able to have compassion, sympathy, and be gentle with us because he's familiar with the temptations that we are.
Just keying off of that thought, John, I think a key phrase is the whole in verse 16 is the with confidence, that you can approach the throne. And sometimes we're hesitant. It's like, okay, I'm coming now with this pet sin of mine for the 6th time this week, and he's got to be sick of me. And forgetting that the whole throne is, yes, it's a throne of sovereignty, but it's a throne of grace too. And so I can approach it with confidence, even after the umpteenth time of slipping into it.
And keying off of that a little bit, another striking connection that jumped out at me between this verse and the gospel, right at the end of verse 16, we go to this throne of grace with confidence in our time of need, our oikairon. And you think about the connection with the gospel where it says that Satan left Jesus until a more opportune time. So Satan knows exactly when to bring the temptations with full force. He also knows exactly when to heap on the guilt in full force. He knows how to get us at just those opportune moments, which are the very moments that we need to go to the throne of grace. And even when we're feeling that guilt in its sharpest pangs, as John mentioned with the pet sin for the umpteenth time, that's the time where more than ever we need to be approaching that throne of grace and can still do so with confidence.
And we can own our weaknesses at of grace. I think that the devil would try us that for us to have to show a little strength and prove our worth, be fight in a way that's worthy of receiving the victory. And this text makes it clear that our Savior, who is the perfect substitute and our great high priest and our champion, who has crushed the head of the devil, he knows very well how weak we are. And we can come to him as we are and hold and cling only to him and to his grace and to his strength.
This was just kind of a unique timing thing that at home with our kids this past week, we read from Esther. And so you have the big scene when Esther's going to approach the king and she's like, well, I can't go to him, unless he calls me. And so she pretties herself up, and, we don't have to pretty ourselves up before God, that we go to the throne in his grace and confidently. So I think that is just a neat thought that you can really dwell on. And just so happened I read that. So that was a nice contrast in my mind of the fear versus the faith and the confidence we approach.
I think the Old Testament text would become a very good introduction sermon. You could just see the Israelites every single day when Goliath comes out, just quaking. They're terrified of this giant that there's no way they could have a chance defeating. And you can see the Christians just with against them, and we can hear the voices of Goliath all around us too, and we have fear. We need to admit that we have fear too as we fight the battle, but this confidence and this grace overcomes that fear.
If you use that for an introduction, it's just you get the great testimony of David, where he ultimately said the reason he's going in confidence is because the battle is the Lord's. It's not really his, it's the Lord's battle. And which just then ties in with the gospel and the second reading, obviously. You guys have any other additional thoughts just on parts of the sermon, like you touched on a possible introduction or even theme in parts, or any illustrations you guys have for anything in here?
One thing that I noticed in the text is that in verse 14 at the end, where it talks about how we hold on to our confession. I was reminded of, as I did a little about the first lesson, and how Goliath had this spear that had a point, an iron point that weighed 15 pounds. He must have had a powerful grip to be able to wield that thing. But David also had a powerful grip, and he had a faith that held on to the promises of God. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews is encouraging Christians to do, to hold on with all of their might to the confession of who Christ is, of who our Father in heaven is, who the Holy Spirit is, and how we have grace and forgiveness because he is our champion.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, as I thought about, how I would maybe outline or divide the text in the sermon, I just kept coming back to this. It's almost a setup where the writer is stressing so much how Jesus is just like us. We don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with us in our weaknesses. He's been tempted in all things. He's been tempted just like us. And that kind of becomes the sum and substance of sort of the first part of the sermon. Like, don't think for a second that Jesus doesn't know what you're going through, that he hasn't faced the temptations that you faced. But then at the very end of that sentence, in a very dramatic way, it's without sin. And then the implications of that in verse 16, that we can go to God's throne with confidence, being the second part of the sermon. And it just seems like, to me, a very natural way to stress both facets of what made Jesus a unique high priest. I mean, every high priest, as chapter 5 goes on to say, was chosen from among the people, was one of them, knew their weaknesses firsthand, but all of them were also sinful. And so they needed to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well. But only Jesus is both like us in every way and without sin.
Is this you think a decent way to handle verse 16? So go to God's throne of grace with confidence to receive mercy, find grace, and help in our time of need. That really you're going to receive multiple things. One is the forgiveness. I'm going there because I failed to stand up to these temptations, and so I'm going for the forgiveness that my high priest won with his sacrifice. But then also help to try and stand up with it in the future. And like an illustration, I can't remember where I heard this, but almost like the trapeze artist, that I'd be terrified to like try jumping from a trapeze to a trapeze, because I assume I'd screw it up and go splat. But if you would put like a net underneath me that I knew couldn't break, okay, now I'm energized to give it a try, because you've removed the element of fear. And that's kind of what Jesus does to help us with our temptations, is rather than looking at his sacrifice as an indulgent thing, it energizes me to like, okay, I'm gonna try and stand up against this and do whatever I need to stand up against this with the help that Christ gives me. And I have the energy of knowing that if I would fail, I'm caught in this unbreakable safety. Is that a proper application of going to him for both mercy and for help?
Well, so tying that back to the first verse, what is one of the things that Satan uses in times of temptation is ultimately you sometimes get to that place of Job's friends where you wonder, okay, well, God's getting back at me for something. And yet you're reminded that through the blood of the high priest, we have that forgiveness. And so highlighting that element of grace, that when I'm facing temptation or I'm just facing difficulty in life, I don't have to sit here and question, oh, does God love me? No, I can have a completely different perspective on this. Just thinking of the temptation against Jesus, if you are, the Son of God. Well, he just was dripping wet from the waters of baptism where he heard the words of, you are my son, my beloved son. So you have that promise to hold on to. And in temptation, I have that promise that can be my quote unquote safety net underneath, that I have God's grace beneath me.
I think too, the other aspect of that is very beneficial, as John mentioned. It's so easy to think of testing as the evil things that we're not supposed to do. But of course, our testing is also the good things that we're supposed to do, and the temptation to let them pass us by. And that safety net, I think, is especially important there. So aside from, boy, I'm going to give it all I've got to not do this wrong thing again that I've done so many times. If we are scared and timid because we're unsure of our relationship with God, the natural tendency is just going to be to hold ourselves up and try and stay away from evil as much as we can. And then we end up in our own self-created monastery instead of actively looking for opportunities to love our neighbor. So I think in that aspect of Christian living too, I can go out and just try and love freely, knowing I'm going to at times screw it up, because I've got this high priest who's done it all for me.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that, the encouragement to do the good that he sets